why are we here? What inspired us to get into science? Now, if you're like me, you might have a similar story of being in your late teens and sort of thinking about seeing people in science and thinking, you know what, I really look forward to spending 40% of my time writing grant proposals to try to do science. And boy, won't it be amazing if I could write papers and then have to rewrite them and rewrite them and rewrite them to finally get them into a journal. And I just am so excited to get a big H index because that'll really mean that I've contributed something to society. Of course, those aren't the reasons that we get into science in the first place, and yet they are the things that are how we are rewarded and what we spend our concrete time worrying about day to day in doing science. And that disjoint is a problem for how it is that we aspire and advance credible, trustworthy science that does benefit society in the way that we know that it does. So what I want to do is talk about a new project that we've just launched, reimagining how to do scholarly communication. Essentially, we're launching a new journal that starts from scratch and say, how is it that we could align the values that we come into science with how science is actually evaluated and ultimately rewarded, so that we can be rewarded for being so damn good that they can't ignore us. So the core claim that I want to start with is that the fact that we used to publish on paper is responsible for a lot of the dysfunction in our research culture. Not comprehensively, but just the structural reality of how it is we created the system of evaluation because we were using paper has had long-term effects that now turn into dysfunctional reward systems. And so if we reimagine how we want to do scholarly evaluation in a digital world, we can actually undo some of those challenges and align how we want science to be evaluated with how it's actually evaluated. So let me explain what I mean of how we got here. So some of us are old enough to have experienced or remember how scholarly communication used to occur from, say, 1960s to mid-1990s. And this is a simplified, abridged version, but imagine this to be how it is that we did our research, right? You conduct the research and you write a paper, you print it out on physical paper, and you mail 4 copies of that paper to the journal. Journal receives those, and there's instructions. You have to clip them this certain way, do not staple them. There's all kinds of requirements of how those papers get bound up and sent to the journal for their processing. Then the journal mails those out to reviewers. The reviewers read them, they mail back their responses, and then the journal mails the author their decisions. All of the revisions, all the copy editing, all of the activity is done by mail. Even in the 1990s, some journals were still doing a lot of that by mail rather than attaching things by email. And then ultimately, the journal gathers those papers into issues, physically prints them, and then mails those out to the subscribers. Open access wasn't really a concept because it had to be physical, and almost all libraries allowed people to enter. So everything was open access in function. You just had to be physically present to be able to read the thing. So you just visit and get it. Okay, so in that simplified context, what are some consequences of how it is we evaluate to decide what scholarship gets into the article that are really rooted in the fact that we had to manage it with paper? First is that you only really conduct peer review for publication after the research is completed. It wasn't practical or pragmatic to think about evaluating it several times as the research was being done. No, finish it up, write it up, send it to us, we'll decide if it's good, and then we'll print it. It was not practical or even conceivable to review anything but the summary paper at the end. What I say was happening in my research. I'm not going to send you all the data or the materials or the code for you to physically have to deal with and reconstruct and how it is you would analyze it. So it was just the paper that got evaluated. It didn't make any sense to mail the paper out to tons of people, so the selection of reviewers was ad hoc. There was only a few of them. And they evaluated the paper in whole. You didn't send it to one person to evaluate one piece and another person to evaluate something else. Everybody just evaluated the paper. Is this publishable or not? Because it had to go into physical print, there's a dichotomous decision at the end. It's in or it's out. And that is the fundamental evaluation. It's peer-reviewed and it's in the journal. Is up, everything else is not. All of that process of what happened is not going to appear in the journal. That would take up pages. So it was opaque. You just knew that the journal did this stuff, and you trusted that the journal did that stuff to do that evaluation process, rather than see that as any part of the scholarship. And then once it's in print, it's in print. It's not going to change. That's the paper. It's final. It's unrevisable. Even retraction doesn't remove those physical pages from the literature. It's still there. All of those things are recognizable now because all of those things are still how we think of what peer review is. But they really are pragmatic considerations that are consequential of having to deal with the fact that we used paper. This is a problem. And this is a problem because all of those things contribute to dysfunctional reward systems that end up reducing the credibility of research. So we start with physical papers and how it is that this is just a summary of those components I just described of evaluating individual pieces of scholarship. So what's the consequence of how we evaluate individual pieces of scholarship for the reward system for scholars? Well, for one, it's outcome-based. People get rewarded for finding new things, for finding positive results, for having neat and tidy stories, all the things fitting together, because you're only reviewing it at the end once you see how everything has come out. And so I decide, is it exciting? Is this advancing things? Is this breaking new ground based on the results? There's no evaluation of the actual content of the research, just the advertising, the paper at the end, rather than the data, the materials, the code, all the things that went into conducting the research itself. That's just not part of how researchers get rewarded. And that reward is a dichotomous decision. Did you get published or not? And we know the review process with 3 reviewers is extremely unreliable. In fact, if you submitted the reliability of peer review to a journal for publication, it would get rejected for being too unreliable because it is unreliable. People have various considerations for what it is they think is worthwhile or not. The process is opaque, and it's these discrete rewards. Each paper is a piece of credit that I then add to my CV, and I accumulate credit by quantity and the prestige of the outlets that I'm in. The impact of that on advancing knowledge production has multiple consequences. As many people in this room have done research related to, it challenges the credibility of the research that's produced. If you're selecting based on outcomes, if you're biased for certain kinds of outcomes, if you're not evaluating the actual content of the research, you're not going to advance credibility. We also hurt the self-corrective processes because if you can't actually see the data, the code, all of the things that went into doing the research, you can't evaluate its credibility in terms of translation from the evidence to the claims. And you can't follow up on it as easily because you don't have access to those materials. It's based on an unreliable and invalid reward system, and it creates markets for predatory journals that sell publication without review, for paper mills that sell authorship on papers for publication, and for fraud. Those markets thrive because it's a single indicator, it's in or it's out, and that is the reward. Is it in? And it comes with the presumption that all of that other stuff happened behind the scenes to make it credible work. But without the evidence of that, because it's an opaque process, those dysfunctional markets actually thrive because they deliver to authors what they need. I need a publication because it's demanded by my department, by my institution, by the nation that I'm in. So buying an authorship on a paper serves the reward that I need to stay in the field. So we're not in a paper world anymore. We are in a digital world, but all of this stuff still persists. And it still persists because of all the barriers to change. We've always done it this way. This feels like the way that we should be doing things. System justification, well, if I'm doing these things, it must be because they're good things. Why would we be doing these things if they were bad things? Publisher business models are invested in the way that we do it today because they make lots and lots of money. And doing it differently feels risky, feels uncertain, feels like, well, how can we change this? Because my rewards are rooted in the system as it is today. How could I do it something different? So ultimately, we know that doing credible research is really hard work. And the current system has one signal in base terms for signaling credible research, which is it published and is that journal a legitimate journal. But there are all these paths to get that signal that require less effort than us doing what we're trying to do every day, working very hard to do the most credible research we can. Now, you can fail to be transparent, you can employ questionable research practices, you can selectively report the results that work. All of those are things that are in the ordinary category, and there are the things in the more extreme categories. You can buy publications, you can buy authorship, you can just make stuff up. All of those are threats to the researchers that are doing credible research because you can get the same rewards without doing the work. And so a change to the system will stand to benefit most those that are actually doing the work, to be able to surface the work that they are doing to try to do the most credible work that they can. So that's where we start from in launching Lifecycle journals. So this is now available. You can submit to Lifecycle Journal, and I just want to give you an overview of kind of how we're trying to approach this and invite you to get involved. This is an R&D project in the sense that we are doing this without any engineering investment by our organization, and instead we are doing it with existing tools and services and a lot of manual workflows to decide, is this worth building an infrastructure to help support? And there are lots of infrastructures that are relevant, so which infrastructures might we just stitch together that are open to make this a scalable solution? But for these 2 years is, let's try it. Let's get some engagement with community to see what works and what doesn't and how we might do this better to decide whether to invest in full. It's free to publish and totally open licensed content. So the Lifecycle Journal concept is to say, let's start from digital only, and how is it that we would try to advance credible research in a way that embraces the flexibility that a digital environment offers. The core starting point, so I'll just highlight some of the key features, but the core starting point is to treat research as a life cycle. Instead of a single evaluation process that happens retrospectively one time at the end, evaluation occurs alongside the research as it happens across the life cycle. So as you're developing your research plans, you can publish them in Lifecycle Journal and get evaluation of those. As the work is being conducted and reported, you can add other components of your research, the data, the code, the materials, and those can be evaluated along the way. As you complete your report, you write your outcomes. This is what we found, and evaluation can occur then. And then if you get feedback in that review process that says, oh yeah, maybe we should have done it that way, you can update it. If 2 years later someone finds an error in your code that changes your results, instead of writing a correction that exists separately from the paper, you just update the paper and have the corrected paper now have a new version. So the idea is to embrace the fact that research occurs across a life cycle, that it's uncertain the whole time, that evaluations change over time, and so should the evaluation process. So how that plays out in practice are things like this. You might, as you're planning, you might post your registration. As you're conducting the work, the data gets, materials get shared, data gets shared, the discussion is all visible. A key part of that is not privileging the paper as the unit of production, but rather the project. And all of those components are legitimate, citable, important scholarly objects, just as important as the summary paper at the end. And what happens along the way is you might get different evaluation services coming in to evaluate your work. So there isn't a singular review process. What COS is providing is a platform to connect independent evaluation services that have different things that they try to evaluate with researchers who are doing their work. And how do we make it easy for researchers to access a diverse community of evaluations to show the credibility of their work? And how do we help evaluation services get to users so that they can conduct those evaluations? So here's an illustration. You might, when you submit your plan, the Peer Community in Registered Reports service, which is a journal-independent peer review service in the normal way of peer review, holistic evaluation, but they conduct review before the research is done. So they evaluate the research plans, Ask, is this an important question? Is the methodology a good methodology to test those questions? And provide review based on that. So you might get feedback from them. Then once your plan goes into, we're ready, we're going into research, then the social science prediction platform might say, okay, we're going to have forecasters make predictions, and we're going to surface that in connection with your paper. This is what type of things that the research community thinks is going to happen in your work. When you have that report, the Data Seer service is an automated service that examines your reporting and looks for quality of data sharing. So it generates a report saying, here are the repositories that you could have shared that in. Here's the evidence that you are sharing your work openly, and provide a report there. And once you're back out into the discussion phase, a group like the Institute for Replication might say, okay, I'm going to grab your data and your code and see if we can independently reproduce it, and then we'll give you a big reproduced check mark as our evaluation of that content. And of course, it's not just those four. There are several different evaluation services, each with their own area of focus of the kinds of things that they are trying to evaluate to assess the credibility of work. So there is no dichotomous, is it in or is it out? What one ends up with is a diverse sample of evaluations that provide insights, and complementary and distinct insights as to what it is, how it is we should understand that work. And one of the big parts from our perspective is that as a platform, our aim is to foster an innovation ecosystem in evaluation. We don't know what the best way is to evaluate research. There are lots of ways that we might improve using machines or empirical methods or humans to be more focused, more elaborative, more distinct. Who knows what kinds of things could emerge on how we might evaluate different kinds of research. And a lot of these services are already doing that on their own. But if we can provide a shared environment, it provides a way to bring visibility to those, to provide comparative investigation between different types of evaluation services, of what added value they have, and to advance a more rigorous and empirically tested set of evaluations rather than the presumption of, well, peer review, well, we've never actually empirically evaluated whether peer review works. Okay, maybe we can create a system that starts to evaluate the quality of review to understand it better. So what it ends up looking like when you do this is you have a page like many of publications, except that the paper is not privileged. Instead, it lists all the components of the research, and it gets updated with versions as you get through the research life cycle. So you can see the prior versions, and you can see what is happening right now, the most up to date. And a key part of that is that you get all of the access to all of the evaluations. And those evaluation services that choose to evaluate your work provide ratings on whatever versions they evaluate. So you might get an evaluation from a service, say, oh, that's interesting feedback, and update it, and then they can update their evaluation. And you can see how it is that the evaluation of that content changes over time. So that's some of the basics of how it is intended to work, and happy to elaborate to the extent that we have time for discussion. I want to address a few of the key questions that come up for this as a model, so that you can sort of assess how is it that this would play out in reality. One concern, obviously, is if you can keep submitting forever when you're done. And the answer is you decide as an author when you are done. So a key feature in the scholarly system of metadata to decide what's a publication is whether a VOR is assigned, a version of record. This says it's a publication. So systems all know, okay, that's a publication, not a preprint. So you decide as an author when you assign a version of record to your paper. And that doesn't mean you can't continue to revise it in the future, but it does signal this is like on my CV like anything else as a publication is on my CV. The or not is also important. If you go through this process at Lifecycle Journal and decide never to assign a VOR, that's fine. It's all open content. It doesn't matter from our perspective. You could say, I've gone through the whole system, gotten interesting evaluations, but now I know I have a science paper, so I'm going to submit it to Science. Go ahead, who cares? That's up to you. Of course, at scale, if we went and tried to make this the way in which scholarship is done, if it always ends up that the endpoint is still one of the standard existing journals, then we won't actually undo the system, because people will still be, the endpoint is still the system as it currently exists. But in the near term, we want people to enter this with no risks, right? You do this, it doesn't cost you anything in the current system. It's just an opportunity to do more. And that's a key part for us. I'll return to that. Another obvious question is, this feels like a lot. Now there's, instead of one evaluation service, there's lots of evaluation services. Oh my God, how much work is this going to be? And in one sense, it's sort of like, yeah, well, obviously there's more work. And in the near term, there will be more, because we're just trying things out, and we're trying a lot of different evaluation services, and we're seeing what happens. But I don't think it's clear in the longer term whether this becomes more burdensome or less, primarily because if I am evaluated as an author based on the actual quality of the work, it's the evaluations that matter. Publication is trivial. I just have to submit it. That's no longer a reward. Now what I need to be rewarded and valued is getting good evaluations. Well, what pressure does that put on the system? The pressure it puts on is to be more careful, to do more rigorous work, to, in fact, invest a little bit more in each thing, rather than churning out as many publications as possible. Also, going through this process is a singular process. There's lots of different evaluation services, but you don't have to engage an editor and a set of reviewers and then get rejected, and then go to another journal and do the same process over again, and then go to another journal and do the same process over again. That is highly burdensome in the existing system, and to the extent that we can lower the amount of repeating the exact same process over again, we may reduce the overall burden. So the increase of investment in any one article may be compensated for by other things, but this is unknown. And then the key part is, will it count, right? There's been lots of interesting innovations in the world of how can we do this better? And they universally fail because they don't take into account the demands of the current system for authors. Many of them are designed so that, well, yeah, this current system's bad, so jump over to our new system and just work there. And people rightly say, well, can I have a job if I work in your system? They say, well, that's not up to us. Say, okay, I'm not going to try your system. So the key design feature here is to make sure that everything is an and. It meets the current system's demands. You have a publication from a legitimate source, just like every other legitimate source you could have a publication in, but you also get the additional things. On your CV here are the evaluations. Peer Community In recommended this paper and evaluated it well. It was reproduced by the Institute for Replication. It was rated as fair data by the Fair Sharing Group. Right? So over time, those evaluations are what should matter. Lifecycle Journal is just the app store. It's just the vehicle for connecting those evaluation services with the users, the authors and the readers. So it should matter not at all, because it's not a credibility system, it's a mechanism for connecting those things. Whereas these evaluations are what should be the basis of evaluation and reward, and that universe of those things can continue to innovate and improve and be evaluated themselves. So let me close just pointing out some of the key themes that are a focus for us in trying out this R&D project and the invitation for you to contribute. Our contention is that the scholarly communication process as it currently exists inhibits progress because of it being slow and incomplete and opaque and static. It's this and it's only that. And we could do much better if we opened the life cycle and allowed the evaluations to evolve with the research itself in the way that we understand how evaluation occurs in reality, not how the system currently works. The current system treats the paper as the only meaningful scholarly object, and we'd be much better off if all of those components of the research themselves were scholarly contributions and evaluated as such and credited as such. The current system is dysfunctional, simple thumbs up, thumbs down, and the status of the journal being the basis of reward, whereas if we can create reward systems that are diversified, that are constantly innovated, that are empirically evaluated, that capture different parts of what's actually credible about the research process, then we'd have a much richer sense of the value of each research contribution. And the current system is calcified. It's dominated by legacy commercial systems, paper-based business models, processes, and infrastructure. This will be an open solution. If it does move to scale, it will be community-led and community-governed. Those evaluation services will set norms for how it is they operate as a community of evaluation services. What should be included and what shouldn't? What are the standards that authors should expect of those? And likewise for how it is that it runs more generally. So I hope that's at least interesting. I'll be delighted to have any questions and skeptical concerns that you have about how this could operate in reality. And I'll remind you that this is an experiment. We're trying something out. So if you're intrigued by the experiment, try it out, and the criticism will be how it is we see if we can actually make it better enough to bring to scale. So thanks very much for your time and attention. Do we have questions? Okay.
Hi, I mean, one of the issues is always how do you get institutions to properly recognize this, right? So for any young researcher, it's going to be a risk even submitting to a non-standard journal, let alone something that is, you know, even if it's better, that is more revolutionary. So I've always wondered, is there a way to get them to accept this? And then secondly, to make it attractive for authors, one of the things that I've often found missing is, like, I've sensitive data, I want to combine it. If there's an entity that can guarantee, look, we're going to do it without sharing the data with the authors as part of the replication process, we are this trusted custodian, I think that would be super valuable for lots of different types of research. Is that something that you are envisioning of including?
Yeah, great questions.
Sorry if I could really quickly interrupt. Let's have, before you ask your question, please introduce yourself, because part of this event is we would love to see everyone here in the room get to know each other. So quickly.
Yeah, I'm Kopia. I'm the director of the Blockchain Center at the Frankfurt School.
Thank you. So for the first part, in the immediate, there aren't risks for authors because they don't have to assign a VOR and they could send it to any journal they want after they go through the process. So the opportunity here for authors is get some feedback on your work while you're doing it. Try this out. And you may at the end say, boy, this is getting so, this is so innovative and interesting that my community does love it, and so I'm going to leave it there. Or they might say, you know what, I still need to submit it to a regular journal because I need to hedge my bets on the credit. Simultaneously, we're working very hard to make sure that this is part of the system. So it will be indexed in all of the ways that these things get indexed, so that, and we'll work on creating visibility, having credible groups associated with it to advance how it is perceived as a credible unit of its own. But we are very attentive to the reducing risk. On the data sharing part, yes, we're quite interested in improving the connectivity between data enclaves or places where things can't be completely open, as this offers the opportunity to be, but you can still, through process, be able to demonstrate reproducibility or how one could, in principle, reproduce findings and otherwise. So we have other work on our existing infrastructure that's trying to improve those connections, but we'd like to surface that in the evaluation process as well in a similar way. We have a pilot going through this process with Meta to give access to Instagram data for people that are going through this evaluation, and all of this will be published in Lifecycle Journal. And they're not able, or willing at least, to share the data openly. And so we have a reproducible process where you can get access to a data enclave for people to be able to demonstrate that, to try to see how we can advance that. So thanks for that question.
Thanks. I'm Sam Toplitsky. I'm the Open Science Librarian on campus and also a journal editor for a Diamond OA journal in the Earth Sciences. Kind of more with my editor hat. I think this is great for the author. It's exceptionally hard to recruit reviewers in the traditional process. I'm curious about how you imagine engaging and growing a broader community who can evaluate not just an article, but data, code, software. That's kind of the hang up we have when we're asking people,
Yeah.
especially separating their disciplinary knowledge from their kind of workflow engagement.
Great question. So the evaluation services operate independently and have their own reviewers and own basis of review. We don't recruit any. We have a managing editor that manages the process, and the evaluation services have their own communities of reviewers. So several of the groups that are involved have an existing user base that's interested in that thing. So for example, there is a group that's really interested in error detection. So after work is done, can we review and audit for trying to find errors in the analysis process and otherwise? That group has a community that's interested in that particular thing. And so what changes from the existing system is the existing system is holistic. You have to recruit people to do all of these things, and now these extra things. And this system is not that at all. It is, each evaluation service has its own thing that it does and their own way of doing it, and it identifies people that are interested in that particular thing. So you might have a group that's only interested in power and precision of estimation. And people say, I love that. I look at papers and I look at how precise their estimates are, and that's what I want to evaluate. And they could evaluate 50 papers very fast because that's the only thing that they pay attention to. So it leverages the advantages of horizontal nature of review rather than having it all vertically integrated in a single process. But it's a great question. Again, all of this is in theory. I'm saying it like, yeah, of course this works, just like it works, right? It works in concept. We have to see how it delivers.
Did you have a question here? No? Okay.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm David Reinstein from the Own Journal. We've been doing something of this nature for the last few years, and I guess one thing that you mentioned just in answering, sorry, I forgot your name, Copier's question. There is this sticking point that authors do, especially young authors, do tend to not want to engage, particularly because they have a fear of having public criticism of their work out there in the open. And we have a particular way that we respond to that question of, isn't my career ruined if someone criticizes me in public? And I think it's something that the community needs to explain is not the case, but I'm curious how you respond to that particular critique. And also, in this model, just to clarify, it is the case that these evaluations will always be public, is that correct?
That's right. So evaluation services can have their own standards, but one of the baseline assumptions is that most of them will operate transparently because that's the way in which the system at large could benefit. But that's still one of those variables that through practice we might say, oh, in some cases, maybe you advertise that some of these services aren't fully transparent, and that's a virtue for some reason. I'm skeptical that that will end up being a virtue, but we have to acknowledge that's a possible reality as we look through the evaluation. But on the broader point of fear of negative evaluations of our work, I certainly understand the fear. I shared it myself until had the experience of realizing that that's how people advance their careers, is in scholarship, we are engaged in a community of skeptical inquiry. That to advance one's career, you have to have people critiquing your work. If everyone is ignoring your work, you are not actually making progress in the field. And so productive engagement with skeptical inquiry is a way that people improve their reputations and advance their careers. And that's easy to say, it's hard to do. And there are lots of occasions where the critique is unproductive, right? It's not scholarly, it's other things. And that requires some strong community norms and standards for how it is that one engages in a productive way in scholarly critique. I'll say that another response is that I have witnessed worse behavior in private than in public. Transparency is a mechanism of accountability, not just for authors, but for reviewers. And having things public makes it harder to act the same way that are kind of amazing things that have happened in private review process where it's only the editor that knows Big Shot is trying to knock down early career researchers' work. So there's lots of complexities in the balance of transparency and the risks that are involved in that. But again, it's a place where we need to experiment with it and evaluate what are the impacts of this. And at the outset, probably people that are more willing to take those perceived risks are going to get involved rather than those that aren't quite ready. So thanks for raising that.
Stefano Della Vigna, UC Berkeley, also co-PI of the Social Science Prediction Platform. Very happy that we're part of this and excited about many of the ideas. So as devil's advocate, as a behavioral economist, I'm all too aware of the limited attention constraints. You know, if as a researcher, I want to look at the recent work in public economics, I know that the Journal of Public Economics is a good place for me to go to. Ideally, I would scan the literature more broadly, but I sort of know that there's a degree of vetting. And so to the extent that this feeds into existing journals, that's fine. But if the Life Cycle Journal wants to be a place where I also look for a good economics article, I don't know how that part would happen, because that's the part that is very sticky for the whole idea of limited attention. People just don't have time to investigate. And so I wonder how that would sort out.
Great. So at scale, the way that works is that the evaluation services become your mechanism for deciding what to read, right? So how do you decide what news to read, right? There's lots of news, but there are certain sources that you use to decide, is this stuff worth paying attention to, right? You have certain news feeds, certain outlets, certain people. Those are all serving the same role of evaluation services for helping filter what is an overwhelming amount of news information for you to decide what to pay attention to. Those evaluation services gain reputation of their own. So there might be the UC Berkeley Economics Department Evaluation Service, that a group of grad students in the department say, we're going to evaluate things that are relevant in our domains and provide evaluations. And they may gain reputation as, man, they're really good at sort of sorting through what's worth reading in this field. And so you might follow that evaluation service, right? Or cluster of evaluation services. Your scientific society may say, you know what, forget the old journal system. We're going to provide evaluations, and we'll select things based on our interest and area of expertise. And so the evaluation services are the mechanism of reward for the authors, and they're also the mechanism of filter for the readers. And with a broad community of them, like we have a broad community of choices for news outlets, we get to select our own that fit for whatever it is our area of expertise and interest are to help drive that interest.
I'm Luis Eduardo San Martin from the World Bank. I think it's clear to me why every different stages of the life cycle journal you presented are important for transparency and reproducibility and openness in general, but it's not quite clear to me why social science prediction is also part of it.
Well, Stefano's here, so I kind of had to.
Yeah, sorry that I am asking this question right after yours, but why? Why is it part of?
Okay. So actually explain, okay. So I take a very broad view of evaluation, is that there are many things that happen in the life cycle of research that shape how it is we engage, understand, and get value out of each other's scholarship. And forecasting, I think, is an under-tested area of how it is that we can decide this work is interesting. This work engages me in a different way in what's going to happen and why should I be invested in what's going to happen in that work, as opposed to everything being about what did happen, right? The story has already been told. Because what happens, I think, and I'd be interested in Stefano's reflections on this with just operating the platform, I think what happens in forecasting environments is people orient in a totally different way to think about the scholarship than just reading it after the fact. And it might change the way that then they make decisions about their own scholarship. Or, oh, I would want to try this variation, or I want to try that. And perhaps be much more theory-driven because you have to generate the whys for how those forecasts are different. Why is it the whole community is saying it's going to go that way? That's bonkers. It's going to go this way. I don't know if you have a different response or if it's appropriate to engage in conversation, but maybe after the fact. Be curious to hear that. So that's why I think big. Let's experiment with lots of types of evaluation. It doesn't have to just be as what you did good. It can be, is that interesting? Does that spur new ideas? Does that spawn other possibilities? Most research ends up being wrong. That's fine. It's not, the point isn't to be right all the time. The point is to sort of keep advancing how it is we conduct the inquiry so we can sort through the right stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This sounds like a really interesting project. My name is Susan Hyde. I'm a political scientist here at UC Berkeley and involved in EGAP. I was just thinking about how to reassure researchers and get them more engaged. And one of the things is just how much longer it would take, if any more time. And it might be interesting to track from registries or something, engagement of studies involved in your process versus study. I mean, maybe you're already doing this, but you know, views in various forms. I know we do that in different ways for studies involved in that are pre-registered in other places versus those that engage in your process, as well as total time till the end point that the researcher selects versus publication. Might be reassuring for junior folks, perhaps, and it might also be a metric that will be useful for folks to track. Perhaps, are you already thinking about that? Have you thought of other ways to kind of think about the cost in terms of time for researchers throughout the process? Yeah,
great question. In the weeds, but appropriate weeds, is that what happens when one submits is that a time window is scheduled for the evaluation services to provide their evaluation. So say you submit your plan, the ideal is that you provide the editor with warning. I'm going to be submitting our research plan in the next couple of weeks. And then they align the evaluation services, tell them what the evaluation period is. It's a defined window. And they all have to schedule out their evaluations to be completed in that time window so that it's brief and it goes relatively quickly. Some of these services have already been working on this to accelerate the time for this. For example, the PCI Registered Reports Group schedules reviewers. So rather than just sending emails to reviewers and begging them to review and then asking them to complete it in 3 weeks, their review process is before they have the paper in hand, they are reaching out and saying, here's the topic, can we schedule your review to happen in this week? And then when people can commit, all of it happens, and it's dramatically reduced time for review. So we're trying to adopt some of those innovations as well to address those obvious concerns that are practical and real. So thanks for that.
Thank you. My name is Susan Awar. I'm a visiting scholar here at SEGA from Uganda, and also currently working on the IDEAL project with SEGA and the World Bank. So my question is about the cost. What would be the cost to the author, and how equitable will it be for authors from low and middle income countries?
So the cost is $0 for authors and $0 for readers. So it'll be all open. As a R&D project, what we are doing is we are paying the costs. So we've raised funds to operate this as a research and development project. We've also recruited a group of people who have been worrying about the scholarly communication space and business models for advancing novel approaches as a committee to evaluate this and the market to see, is there a viable business model that can keep it all open so that authors don't have to pay and readers don't have to pay. So members of that group include Rain Crow and Heather Joseph from Spark, Chris Borg from MIT Libraries, and several others that are really just, they know this space really well and have been thinking hard about how to develop alternative models to try to make sure that we can do this in the open as public goods infrastructure. So the answer is not clear yet, but the work is happening alongside the R&D project. So thanks for that question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks for the inspiring work that you're doing. It is so important. You've envisioned a better world for scientific publishing in which the existing legacy journal system with all its inefficiency, anti-scientific practices, exploitativeness, and problems withers away. For scientists, editors, reviewers, people who are currently involved in that system, do you envision a way that Lifecycle Journal can help speed the arrival of the glorious future that you've laid out for us?
Well, the hope, so like our other initiatives, the hope is to get early adopters to try it out and to demonstrate value, and then to make visible the value that they have gotten out of participating as authors, as evaluation services, as reviewers in those evaluation services, as readers of that work, to say, oh, this actually works, and then to grow incrementally, but hopefully quickly, from that initial early adopter base. It is using the exact same strategies that our organization used for the adoption of OSF and open science in individual work. So really for us, this is a complement to the last 10 years of work. So our initial focus was how do we help individual researchers be more open in their research process. Lifecycle Journal is how do we connect the fact that researchers are doing that now with the evaluation process that can occur on top of it. And the interplay between those is a mechanism of giving the community another way to do evaluation and to reward that evaluation. I don't think, it's always hard, and it was very hard at the outset of doing this 12 years ago, because it would be Pollyanna, that's ridiculous. You understand the reality of how these things work. This is just Pollyanna talk, and no one will ever do it. And it's very hard to start, but it's not hard to continue. And so it's getting it started and then demonstrating the value that really is the key barrier to overcome, and then to adapt to the various models. Because I think once people see it in action for themselves, it's going to be the same as many people's experiences with things like pre-registration, which is like, why haven't we been doing this all along, right? I want the evaluation from others. I got into scholarship because I want people to interact with my work and to learn from them and them to learn from me. And that's part of the joy of scholarship. But the current system is set up so that the reviewers are my enemy, right? They are in between me and the reward that I need. But if the reward becomes engagement with them, and that's how I gain reputation, is because I'm engaged in my community and people can see, wow, they're really thoughtful about how it is that the critiques that someone made of their work is responded to with productive new ideas. That will be a system that I think we'll all feel better about. And it's not a system that doesn't exist. The open source software community, when people find errors in other people's software, it's not this, this clap back, you ass for finding that error. It's thank you. Oh, that's amazing. Thanks for looking at my work, and now my work is better. So these are not hard things for us to do once we're doing them. It's hard to start. Thanks. Thanks.